The drive through miles of empty fields gave me plenty of time to consider what I was about to encounter. I'd been called out to investigate strange patterns that had appeared in a field near a small, isolated town. The locals couldn't, or wouldn't, explain them. As an agronomist, I was used to rural mysteries, most of which turned out to be simpler than people expected. Soil issues, weather patterns, pests. This assignment felt like it would be no different, just another puzzle waiting to be solved. When I arrived, though, I was met with an unexpected coldness from the townsfolk. They regarded me with thinly veiled suspicion, casting quick glances in my direction, as if I were poking around in things best left alone. They'd insisted someone come look at the marks, but now that I was here, it was as if they regretted reaching out. "Just be careful," the clerk at the town hall had murmured as he handed me the directions to the field, his eyes darting around as though he were afraid of being overheard. The field's been odd for years. Strange things happened there. I'd shrugged it off at the time, attributing his warning to superstition. Small towns often had stories and legends about strange patches of land or peculiar occurrences, and my job was to cut through those stories and find the science behind them. When I arrived at the field, I parked on the narrow dirt road nearby, stepping out into the hot, dry air. A few stunted trees lined the edges, their twisted branches casting long shadows over the land. In the middle of the field, the marks sprawled in complex, intricate shapes, forming strange symbols I didn't recognize. I'd expected something random or scattered, perhaps marks left by animal movement or an amateur's prank. But this was different. The patterns were precise, with lines that curved and intersected, almost like a language written into the soil. I walked the perimeter, trying to discern where the shapes started and ended, but there seemed to be no clear beginning or end. The soil around the marks was noticeably dry, far more so than the ground beyond. I bent down, picking up a handful of the cracked earth. It crumbled easily, like dust. The sensation of being watched crept up on me, and I glanced around, half expecting to see someone hidden among the trees. But I was alone, surrounded by the quiet of the field and the strange shapes in the dirt. I forced myself to shake off the unease. There was nothing here but soil and symbols, no ghosts hiding in the trees. I took out my camera and began documenting the shapes, snapping pictures of each mark and noting any differences between them. Some of the marks seemed deeper, as though whatever had made them had pressed down with more force in certain areas. I moved from one to the next, my eyes tracing the lines, each pattern stirring something in me that I couldn't quite name. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the field, I started to pack up, but a chill ran down my spine. I brushed it off as fatigue from the long day, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was different here, something beyond the ordinary. Back in town, the clerk barely looked up when I returned the key to the field gate. He muttered a few words of thanks, his eyes avoiding mine, but he seemed almost relieved that I was leaving. I left, glancing over my shoulder one last time at the direction of the field. The day had gone as expected, mostly, but that strange, lingering feeling stayed with me, haunting me as I made my way back to the small room I was renting. Lying in bed that night, the shapes I'd seen came back to me. They weren't just marks, they felt intentional, as if someone had put them there for a reason. And though I couldn't explain it, I felt drawn to return, to understand what those symbols meant and why they unsettled me so deeply. The next morning, I headed into town to gather background information. I was hoping someone might know more about the strange marks or, at the very least, be able to tell me if they'd appeared before. But as I walked through the quiet streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was unwelcome. People averted their eyes when I tried to make conversation, their faces tight with discomfort. After a string of short, reluctant answers, I met Martha, an elderly woman who seemed less hesitant than the others. She watched me with sharp, assessing eyes, and finally invited me to sit beside her on a bench in front of her small, cluttered shop. When I mentioned the field, her face clouded over. "You're here about the marks," she said, her voice low. "Thought no one would come out to that place again." I explained that I was investigating the marks as part of my work, hoping to find a natural explanation for them. Her expression was unreadable as she listened, but when I finished, she shook her head slowly. "Those marks have been there on and off for as long as I can remember. They don't just happen. They're always in that field, never spreading, never fading away entirely. People who step on them, they don't come back the same." She told me stories of people who'd visited the field and returned listless, disconnected, like something had drained them. She described how one man, a neighbor of hers, had been obsessed with the place, visiting day after day until one morning he simply vanished. "It took his soul," she said in a hushed tone. "That field doesn't belong to us. It belongs to whatever lies underneath it." I did my best to keep my expression neutral, but a shiver ran down my spine. Part of me wanted to dismiss her words as mere superstition, a mix of rumor and lore that had grown over the years. Yet her stories struck a chord, stirring up the same feeling I'd had in the field, the inexplicable sensation of being watched. After thanking Martha, I spent the afternoon at the town's tiny library, digging through archives and newspaper clippings. I hoped to find something, anything, that might explain the marks. But the records were sparse. Only a handful of articles mentioned the field, each one detailing a similar tale. Someone visiting the field, returning changed, or in some cases, not returning at all. As the sun began to set, I realized I'd spent hours immersed in the past, a growing sense of dread gnawing at me. The more I read, the less certain I became about the rational explanations I'd clung to. What if there was some truth in these stories? Before leaving, I collected soil samples from the field and sent them to a lab for analysis. But even the soil near the marks was strange. In the center of each symbol, the soil was dry and cracked, yet around the edges, it was loamy, almost fertile. I'd never seen anything like it. Plants that should have thrived were weak or dead, and small animal bones, half buried in the earth, peeked out from around the edges of the marks. Back at my room, I tried to review my findings, but my mind kept returning to Martha's warning. I couldn't help but think of the man who had vanished, his obsession with the marks growing until he'd disappeared without a trace. I wanted to believe there was a rational answer, but each new discovery chipped away at my confidence, leaving me with more questions than I'd started with. That night, I dreamed of the field. I saw the marks glowing under the moonlight, bright and almost alive, their patterns shifting as though they were calling to something, waiting for it to answer. And just beyond the field's edge, half hidden in shadow, I saw a figure watching me, its face blurred, its eyes fixed on mine. I woke up, my heart pounding, my body drenched in a cold sweat. The dream felt more like a memory than a nightmare, a warning that lingered in the silence of my room. As I lay there, the thought struck me. What if the field was more than just a place? What if it was a gateway, or worse, a prison? The rational part of me resisted, pushing against the idea, but deep down, I knew I couldn't turn back now. Whatever was hidden in that field, I was determined to uncover it, even if it meant confronting the very thing that had haunted this town for generations. The next morning, I woke with a sense of dread still lingering from the dream, but my curiosity was sharper than ever. Despite Martha's warnings and the stories I'd read, I felt a pull, a need to return to the field and see it at night, under the same pale moonlight from my dream. I told myself it was just my scientific instinct, the part of me that refused to be scared off by local folklore. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I waited until dusk before setting out, the world around me growing colder and quieter as I neared the field. When I arrived, the light had faded almost completely, and the twisted trees around the edges cast long, eerie shadows across the ground. The air was still, unnaturally so, and I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, as though something unseen were watching me, waiting. I walked toward the center of the field, the patterns in the soil becoming clearer under the faint light. The marks seemed to glow, faintly pulsing in a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. I stepped carefully around them, but the urge to enter the center of the design was almost overwhelming. As I moved closer, a sudden dizziness washed over me, and for a moment I felt as if I were somewhere else entirely. The world around me faded, replaced by shadowy figures moving in silence. I blinked, trying to shake off the vision, but it only grew clearer. The figures wore dark cloaks, their faces hidden, and they moved in a circle around the center of the field, their bodies swaying in unison. They were chanting, low and rhythmic, their words blending with the wind in a language I didn't recognize. I took a step back, my heart racing. My rational mind insisted it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but every instinct I had screamed otherwise. This was real. I was seeing something that had happened here years ago. A memory burned into the very soil. The vision faded, and I found myself back in the quiet field, the cold air biting into my skin. I felt drained, like the very life had been pulled from me. Yet somehow I couldn't bring myself to leave. I was drawn to these marks, to the story they told, and I knew I had to understand them, no matter what it took. After steadying myself, I began to examine the symbols more closely. Each line, each curve, felt intentional, like a language written for something ancient and powerful. As I moved along the patterns, my fingers grazing the dry, cracked earth, I felt the whispers return, faint and almost melodic, pulling at me, drawing me closer to the center. I knelt down, pressing my hand against one of the deeper lines, feeling the chill of the soil seeping into my skin. And in that instant, a wave of images flooded my mind. Flashes of rituals, hands lifting objects toward the sky, faces etched with fear and reverence. I saw the townspeople, some familiar, others long gone, gathered in a circle, their eyes wide with terror as they repeated words in unison, voices trembling. I pulled my hand away, gasping, my mind reeling from the vision. The ground beneath me felt alive, humming with an energy that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the soil, it was something beneath it, a presence that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat, watching me, waiting. I forced myself to stand, my body unsteady. As I backed away from the center of the field, the whispers faded, but their echo remained, haunting the silence around me. The marks on the ground were no longer just patterns. They were symbols of something ancient, a warning or perhaps a boundary, a reminder that this place was not meant to be disturbed. That night, back in my room, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cloaked figures, heard their chants, felt the weight of their fear. I tried to convince myself it was just an overactive imagination, fueled by the town's stories and the eerie setting of the field. But a part of me knew better. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. These marks weren't natural, and they weren't the work of any human hand, at least not in any way I understood. Whatever had been sealed here, whatever the townsfolk feared, was real. And as much as I wanted to turn back, I knew that I wouldn't stop until I'd uncovered the truth. Something in the field was calling to me, and I wasn't sure if I could resist its pull, even if I wanted to. By the following morning, exhaustion weighed on me, both from the lack of sleep and the visions that had filled my night. I couldn't shake the feeling that the field was trying to tell me something, that each mark held a message I was meant to decipher. Determined to find answers, I made my way to the town's small library, hoping that there might be records that could shed light on the field's history. After hours of searching through dusty archives and forgotten books, I found something. In a record of local folklore, hidden in the back of an old ledger, there was a passage about the field. The entry was written in the scrawling handwriting of someone long gone, but the words sent a chill down my spine. It spoke of an ancient ritual, one that had been performed on that very spot centuries ago. According to the account, the ritual had been done to trap something beneath the earth, a presence, an entity that thrived on human energy. The markings on the soil weren't natural. They were a seal, a boundary keeping whatever lay beneath it from emerging. And the townsfolk had known about it, passing down warnings and stories, hoping that future generations would leave the field undisturbed. As I read, a sinking feeling settled over me. If the marks were a seal, a barrier, then my investigation might have weakened it. Each time I touched the soil, I could feel the energy beneath stirring, as if the very ground had been waiting for someone to disturb it. I recalled the vision I'd had, of cloaked figures chanting under the moon, their voices trembling. They hadn't been worshipping, they'd been afraid. With this new understanding came a wave of dread. I had to confirm it, to see if my investigation had truly affected the field. That night, armed with the ritual instructions I'd found in the records, I returned to the field, determined to examine it one last time. The night air was heavy as I arrived, the quiet almost oppressive. I could barely make out the shapes of the marks in the dark, but as I neared the center, my breath caught. The symbols were glowing, no longer faint, but with an unnatural light, their lines pulsing in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The sight froze me, and I realized with horror that the seal was failing. I took a step back, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. The markings were alive, responding to the weakening of their own power, and I could feel a presence lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to break free. I thought of the stories Martha had told me, of people returning from the field changed, or not returning at all. I understood now what had drawn them here, what had compelled them to come back even when they knew the danger. The entity in the field didn't just feed on energy. It called to people, luring them closer with an invisible pull. I knew then that I couldn't walk away. If I left, whatever was beneath the soil would be free to wreak havoc on the town, perhaps even beyond. And the only way to stop it was to reinforce the seal, to perform the ritual exactly as it had been done so long ago. I lit the candles I'd brought, setting them around the perimeter of the largest symbol, just as the instructions had specified. My hands trembled as I spoke the ancient words I'd memorized, words that felt foreign on my tongue, weighted with meaning beyond my understanding. The air around me grew colder, the ground beneath my feet vibrating as though something were pushing against it, fighting to break free. As I recited the words, shadows began to gather around me, the dark shapes of those who had once performed this ritual, their faces hidden, but their forms unmistakably human. They moved in silence, watching me, their presence both comforting and terrifying. I felt a deep, primal fear, but I forced myself to continue, my voice steady as I called upon the symbols to hold. The entity's presence grew stronger, pressing against the barrier. I could feel it probing my mind, searching for a weakness, an entry point. It was vast, ancient, a force that had existed long before I had ever set foot in this town, and for a moment I wondered if I had the strength to contain it. But I couldn't stop. I repeated the words louder this time, each syllable echoing across the field. The ground shook beneath me, and the symbols flared, their light growing blinding as the entity strained against them. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the ground went still. The glow from the symbols faded, settling into a soft, quiet pulse. The presence receded, sinking back into the depths beneath the soil. I fell to my knees, my body exhausted, every nerve buzzing with the remnants of energy I had poured into the ritual. The shadows of the figures slowly vanished, leaving me alone under the cold, clear sky. I took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of what I had just done. The seal had been reinforced for now, but I knew it wouldn't hold forever. One day, someone else would have to stand here, repeating the ritual, keeping the entity confined. But for tonight, the town was safe. As I left the field, the marks seemed quiet, their energy subdued, as if in a temporary slumber. But as I walked away, I felt a strange connection to them, a part of me still bound to the field, and to the secret it guarded. The morning after the ritual, I felt as if a storm had passed through me, leaving only a hollow calm in its wake. Every muscle ached, as though the field had drained a piece of my vitality, a toll exacted by forces I'd barely understood. Yet there was a strange peace in knowing the seal had been restored, if only for a time. Before leaving town, I visited the field one last time. Under the soft light of dawn, it looked ordinary again, a quiet stretch of land, no different from any other. But I knew better. The marks, though faint, still pulsed with a hidden energy, a reminder of what lay beneath. And though I'd completed the ritual, I felt an inexplicable connection to this place, as though I'd left a part of myself here, woven into the earth and the symbols themselves. As I stood there, I became aware of a shift in the air, a faint whisper that I couldn't fully understand but felt deep within. It was as if the field itself were acknowledging my presence, a final murmur that was both a warning and a farewell. I had the sense that it was grateful, if such a thing were possible. I left the field with a feeling of finality, aware that I'd done my part, yet deeply unsettled by the knowledge of what still lay beneath. The townspeople watched me as I drove away, their faces unreadable, though I could see relief mingling with a cautious gratitude. They knew somehow that the field was at peace again, even if they couldn't explain why. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to my work, immersing myself in research and projects that had once fascinated me. But my experience in the field left a mark I couldn't shake. My colleagues remarked that I seemed different, more introspective, though they didn't press for details. And late at night, I'd sometimes catch myself glancing out the window, wondering if the field had begun to stir again. The ritual had bound me to it, a silent keeper of its secret, a connection I could neither deny nor escape. One evening, as I sifted through my notes, I found a piece of paper from my investigation, a rough sketch I'd made of the symbols, faded and worn. A chill ran through me as I traced the lines with my finger, the memories flooding back with the force of a warning. I knew then that the seal was only temporary, and that one day the marks would need reinforcing again. For now, the field slept, but it wouldn't be silent forever, and somehow I knew it was only a matter of time before it called to me once more.